The axe came down, and the log split clean. Garrett Hale set the two halves aside, picked up another, and did it again. That was how his mornings went. No alarm. No schedule. Just the weight of the axe, and the smell of pine, and the sound of the mountain doing nothing at him. He had lived on this ridge for 6 years. Before that, he had spent 22 years as a field medic with the Galactic Cooperative Relief Corps, patching up soldiers on planets he could not pronounce, in wars that started before he arrived and continued long after he left. He had watched too many people die for reasons that made sense to someone in a very tall building far away. When his contract ended, he did not re-sign. He bought a plot of land on Earth, in a range of mountains that did not care about galactic politics, and he built a small cabin, and he chopped wood every morning because it was useful and it cleared his head. He was not unhappy. He was just done. The knock came while he was stacking the split logs against the side wall. 3 sounds. Not loud. Patient. Like someone who had all the time in the world and had decided to use a small amount of it on his door. He thought it was Koss, his neighbor from the farm 2 ridges over. Koss sometimes came by to complain about the weather. Garrett set down a log and walked around to the front. He opened the door. There was no one there. He looked left. He looked right. He was about to close the door and go back to the wood when something made him look down. The creature sat on the second porch step. It was roughly the size of a large house cat. Its scales were the color of deep space between stars, not black exactly, more like the absence of color that exists past the edge of light. Its eyes were the color of old copper, round and bright, and completely still. It had 4 legs, 2 folded wings pressed flat against its back, and a tail that wrapped neatly around its front feet. 1 small claw was raised, mid-knock, as if it had just finished. Garrett looked at it for a long time. It looked back at him with an expression that was difficult to read but seemed to contain, somewhere inside it, the suggestion that it had been waiting and was prepared to continue waiting for as long as required. He said, "No," and he closed the door. 3 seconds passed. Then 3 knocks. Exactly as patient as before. He opened the door again. The creature had not moved. It tilted its head a small amount to one side. The copper eyes did not blink. Garrett had treated injured soldiers, civilians caught in crossfire, alien species whose biology he had to figure out in the middle of emergencies. He was not a man who panicked. But he stood in his doorway for a full 30 seconds trying to find a reason not to do what he was about to do. He could not find one. "Just until you warm up," he said. He stepped aside. The creature walked in with a calm that suggested it had already decided this was its home and was simply letting him catch up. Garrett closed the door. He went to the kitchen. He heated up a can of vegetable soup because it was what he had, and because he had a feeling, based on nothing he could explain, that this thing had not eaten recently. He set the bowl on the floor. The creature sat in front of it. It looked at the soup. It looked at him. Then it bent its head and ate, slowly and neatly, with the kind of composure that made Garrett feel like he should have used a better bowl. He sat at the kitchen table and watched. He did not know what it was yet. He would find out later. He would find out a great many things later. Things that would make the next several weeks of his life extremely complicated. But right now it was cold outside and the creature had knocked, and he had opened the door, and that was the whole of it. He told himself it meant nothing. Somewhere in orbit, 17 warships received an emergency signal. The dragon hatchling had bonded. Garrett woke the next morning to find the creature asleep on top of his medical bag. It had also reorganized his bookshelf. The books were now sorted by subject, medical texts together, history together, the small shelf of fiction separated from both. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he made coffee and decided not to think about it. He had spent the night doing quiet research. He knew now what she was. The scale pattern, the wing structure, the copper eyes. She was a dragon hatchling. Not a pet, not a companion animal. A dragon. The oldest species in the known galaxy. A creature that, according to everything he could find, had not hatched a new member in close to 40 years. He also found, buried in a short passage in a very dry academic text, the concept of the first knock. A hatchling, upon emerging, chose one being in the galaxy to bond with. The bond was permanent. It could not be transferred, bought, or undone. Every recorded bond in history had been with kings, high commanders, ancient priests, or galactic rulers of significant power. He read that part twice. Then he looked at the hatchling sleeping on his medical bag in his small mountain cabin, and he drank his coffee. His radio, which he had not turned on in 4 years, turned itself on. Mr. Hale. The voice was young, professional, and moving slightly too fast. My name is Ren Aldis. I'm the Earth liaison with the Galactic Cooperative. Please do not be alarmed, but you are about to have company. Garrett looked out the window. 3 large ships were descending into the valley below his mountain. Not warships, diplomatic vessels. Long, clean, very expensive looking. They landed in the flat field near the old logging road and immediately began extending walkways and signal arrays. The hatchling woke up. She looked out the window. She made a sound like a small stone dropped into deep water. Then she climbed onto Garrett's shoulder and watched. They came one group at a time. Ren had arranged it that way, she explained when she called back, to prevent any single representative from claiming priority. Each group was different. Each was impressive in a way that felt designed to make Garrett aware of how unimpressive he was by comparison. The first group represented a high king from a system 17 light-years out. They wore robes that changed color when they moved. They offered Garrett a seat on the king's advisory council and a residence on a planet with 3 moons. The hatchling did not look at them once. The second group was from a military empire. They offered him a rank and a ship and a salary that would have been life-changing at any previous point in his existence. The hatchling yawned. The third group brought a case containing what they called a piece of a dying star, compressed into a gem. They placed it on his kitchen table. The hatchling leaned forward and sniffed it. Then she looked at Garrett with an expression that seemed to say, "Your call." He passed. They took the gem back. Every group asked the same thing in different words. What did you do? What was the ritual? What did you offer? There must be something, a bloodline, a technique, an ancient inheritance they had not accounted for. Garrett told each of them the same thing. She knocked. It was cold. I opened the door. Not one of them believed him, but not one of them could find a different answer either. By afternoon, Ren Aldis appeared at the cabin herself. She was in her late 20s, wearing a cooperative uniform that still had a new issue stiffness to it, and she looked like she had not slept. She stood on the porch with a data pad and a thermos of something and stared at the hatchling on Garrett's shoulder. She's bigger, Ren said. A little, Garrett agreed. She had grown a few inches since the night before. He had noticed. Ren looked at her notes. Then she looked up. The Elder Council is coming. Who's that? Ren's expression did something complicated. The governing body of dragonkind. The oldest living dragons in the galaxy. They have not left their home system in 400 years. Garrett considered this. Do you want coffee? He said. Ren said yes. She sat at his kitchen table and stared at the wall while he made it. The hatchling climbed off his shoulder and sat on the table in front of Ren and looked at her steadily until Ren looked back. She won't hurt you, Garrett said. I know, Ren said. That's actually not the part I'm worried about. The Elder Council's ship did not land like the diplomatic vessels had. It descended slowly, with a kind of weight that had nothing to do with its size, and when it touched down in the valley the ground did not shake so much as settle, as if the earth had decided to pay attention. Garrett watched from the porch. The hatchling sat beside him. She was the size of a medium dog now. 3 days of bonded growth. He had stopped being surprised by it, and moved on to simply noting it, the way you noted weather. Ren had prepared a diplomatic pavilion in the valley. She had also, quietly, suggested that Garrett might want to find something formal to wear. He told her he had a work jacket that was clean. She looked at him for a long moment and said that would be fine. He wore the work jacket. It was dark green and had a small repair on the left elbow. He walked down the mountain path with the hatchling at his side, and he did not feel nervous, which he suspected said something about what 22 years of field work did to a person's sense of what qualified as a threatening situation. High Cedar Vein was very old. That was the first thing. Garrett had seen old creatures before, species that lived for centuries, elders of various kinds. But Orvain had a quality of age that was different. He was large, even by dragon standards, his scales a dark gray that had faded at the edges to something close to white. His eyes were gold with a depth that suggested they had been watching things for longer than most civilizations had existed. 3 other council members stood behind him. None of them spoke. Orvain looked at Garrett. Then he looked at the hatchling. Then he looked at Garrett again. You are the one she chose, he said. His voice was low and even and very clear. That's what everyone tells me, Garrett said. The reckoning was a formal process. Orvain explained it without ceremony. The council had the right to examine any bond that raised questions of suitability. They were not here to undo the bond. That was not possible, but to understand it, and to determine what formal standing Garrett would hold in relation to dragon kind going forward. He asked Garrett questions. Garrett answered them. There was no trick to it. He had spent enough time in difficult situations to know that the worst thing you could do when someone important was questioning you was try to perform. He just said what was true. He had served 22 years in field medicine. He had retired because he was tired. He lived alone because it was quieter. He had no title, no political connections, no galactic standing worth mentioning. He had opened the door because something had knocked and it was cold outside. He had not tried to use the bond because he did not know what using it would even mean, and more importantly, he did not want anything from it. Orvain listened without expression. Then he asked the question the others had not asked. He said, "Every other being in recorded history who received a dragon bond sought power immediately. You have been offered a great deal of it in the past 3 days. Why have you refused?" Garrett thought about it. Not for long. I spent a long time watching people die for reasons decided by people who had too much power and too little sense, he said. I don't want that. I have a mountain and enough wood stack to get through winter, and a book I'm about halfway through. That's enough. Silence. Orvain looked at the hatchling. She had been sitting quietly throughout all of this. Now, in the silence, she made a sound. It was a small sound, low and warm, like the last breath of a fire before sleep. It came from somewhere in her chest. The 3 council members behind Orvain reacted. Not dramatically, but their heads moved. They looked at each other with the careful stillness of people who have just seen something they did not expect. Orvain's expression changed by a very small amount. Something in it softened, not weakened, just changed shape. We will deliberate, he said. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. He looked back at Garrett with an expression that was hard to read, and perhaps was not meant to be read. She has not made that sound since she hatched, he said quietly. Not once. He did not explain what the sound meant. He walked back toward the ship. Garrett stood in the valley with the hatchling beside him and the mountain above him and the weight of something very old pressing gently against the afternoon air. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. He said, "You could have knocked on a better door, you know." She closed her eyes. The sound came again, small and warm. He walked back up the mountain. By the end of that week, the hatchling was no longer a hatchling in any practical sense. She had grown past the size of a horse. Her scales had deepened in color, turning from deep space black to something richer, the kind of dark that lives at the bottom of clear water. Her wings, when she stretched them on the porch in the mornings, caught the light in a way that made it look briefly like the air around her was thinking. Garrett had adjusted. He adjusted the way he always adjusted to new circumstances, by changing as little as possible and working around what had changed. He moved the firewood to make space near the cabin wall for her to sleep. He reinforced the porch railing because she liked to lean on it. He told Koss, his neighbor, what had happened, in simple terms. Koss leaned on the fence post, looked at the dragon sleeping in a patch of sun near the woodpile, and said, "Well, that explains the ships." Ren Aldis had set up a temporary station in a cooperative tent near the tree line. She came to the cabin most days to update Garrett, drink his coffee, and look increasingly like someone managing a situation that had grown past its original container. One afternoon, she told him the full truth about what the bond meant, not the short version she had given him earlier. A bonded dragon grew in power proportionally with the depth of the bond. The bonded companion shaped that growth, not by command, but by character. A dragon bonded to a warlord learned the shape of war. A dragon bonded to an emperor learned the weight of control. The reason every ruler in the galaxy had wanted Sara was not just status. It was strategy. A dragon was not a weapon you pointed. She was a force that took the shape of whoever she stood beside. So what does she become if she's bonded to a retired medic on a mountain? Garrett said. Ren was quiet for a moment. We don't know. That's the part that makes the elders uncertain. And it's also possibly the part that makes this the most important bond in 1,000 years. Garrett did not say anything to that. Admiral Drevka came 2 days later. Not with ceremony. He arrived in a small transport and walked up the mountain path alone, which Garrett respected. He was a large man, older, with a face that had seen the same kinds of things Garrett's had. They sat on the porch and drank coffee, and talked like two people who had both spent a long time in places where things went wrong. Drefka said, "You should know that 3 of the 7 rulers who came here are not finished. They can't take the bond, but they can try to take you." Garrett looked at him. "If you're gone," Drefka said simply, "the bond breaks. Sara goes into grief stasis. She'd be vulnerable. They'd move then." "You're telling me this because you're going to protect us," Garrett said. It was not quite a question. "I'm telling you because you strike me as someone who does better when he knows what he's dealing with," Drefka said. "My ships are in orbit, but I can't cover every angle from up there." They sat for a while. Sara lay in the yard below the porch. She was watching the tree line with calm attention, the way she watched most things, as if she was simply noting everything and storing it for later. That night, Garrett sat on the porch steps after dark. The sky above the mountain was clear. He could see 3 of the ships in orbit as steady points of light that didn't move the way stars did. He had come here to be done. Done with decisions made in tall buildings. Done with other people's wars. Done with the particular exhaustion of caring about things you couldn't fix. He looked at Sara. She had settled beside him without being asked, her side warm against his arm. He said, out loud, to no one in particular, "I didn't ask for this." She didn't move. She was just there, solid and warm and present in the way that large, calm animals are present, which is to say, completely. He said, "I know. Neither did you." He put his hand on her side. She breathed out slow. The ships in orbit didn't move. The mountain did nothing. The night was very quiet and very cold, and in a few days something would come up that path that was not the neighbor and was not carrying coffee. But that was a few days away. The team came on a night when the cloud cover was low and the mountain was dark. 12 operatives, moving in 2 groups of 6. Well-equipped, coordinated, and working from intelligence that was accurate in most ways. They knew the cabin layout. They knew Garrett's background, field medic, no combat training on record, retired and isolated. They had a containment unit for the hatchling, sized for an animal much smaller than Sara currently was, which told Garrett everything about how recent their information was. He knew they were coming because Sara woke him at 2 in the morning by placing one large foot very carefully on his chest and staring at the door. He had learned, in the past week, that she did not do things without reason. He got up quietly. He checked the window without showing himself in it. He saw the first group moving through the tree line 200 meters out, using light dampening gear and moving well. He had seen that kind of movement before, in fields on other planets, at night, when he was the one they were moving toward for different reasons. He radioed Ren. She picked up immediately. She had not been sleeping either. "I see them," she said. "Drefka's been notified. Response team is 12 minutes out." 12 minutes was a long time. He dressed. He did not arm himself. He had no weapons and would not have used them anyway. What he had was the cabin, the terrain, and 22 years of staying functional when things went badly. And he had Sara. That was the part the operatives had not accounted for. Their containment unit was sized wrong. Their timeline assumed a sleeping medic and a manageable animal. What they found when the first team breached the tree line was a dragon the size of a large horse standing in the open yard in front of the cabin, completely still, watching them with copper eyes that caught no light because there was no light to catch. They stopped. Garrett stepped onto the porch and said, in the same voice he used to use when a field situation was about to go wrong in an expensive way, "Don't." Not to Sara. To the team. Sara had not moved. That was the problem. A charging animal you could plan for. An animal standing completely still and radiating something that made the air feel pressurized. Something that made the back of your brain send a very old and very clear signal about apex predators. That was harder to plan for. The second group came from the north side. They were quieter, but Sara turned her head before they reached the edge of the yard, and they stopped too. Garrett walked down the porch steps and stood in the yard. He did not look at the teams. He looked at Sara. Her scales had shifted to a color he had not seen before, a deep, dark red at the edges, like heat seen through stone. He said her name, not loudly, evenly. She turned her head to look at him. He said, "They're scared. Let them be scared and stay still." What he was asking was not small. He understood that. She was angry in a way that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with something that had been building since the moment she was hatched and passed from hall to hall and throne room to throne room and presented to one ruler after another like something to be owned. He could feel it. not mystically, just the way you can feel the temperature of a room change. He said, I'm here. We're fine. Let Drevka's team handle it. 30 seconds passed. She was still. The color at the edges of her scales faded. Drevka's response team arrived 9 minutes later, not 12. They secured all 12 operatives without incident. None of the operatives had been harmed. Several of them, Ren told Garrett later, had needed a medical assessment on account of shock. Not physical injury, just the particular effect of having stood in a dark yard while something very old and very patient decided not to kill them. Ren stood on the porch afterward with her data pad and said, the Elder Council was monitoring. I know, Garrett said. He had assumed. They watched the whole thing. All 4 of them. Garrett said nothing. The part they're talking about, Ren said carefully, is not that you held your ground. It's that she listened to you. In that state, she has never responded to a voice command in any prior interaction. Not once. Not with anyone. She paused. Orvain has requested an audience. Garrett looked out at Sarah, who was lying in the yard in the dark with her head on her front feet, watching him with half-closed copper eyes. Not a reckoning, he said. He said audience. Yes, Ren said. Garrett exhaled. I'll need a clean jacket, he said. Orvain met him alone. No ceremony. Garrett had asked for that, through Ren, and the request had been granted without comment. They sat in a small room aboard the council's ship. 2 chairs, a low table, plain walls. Not what Garrett had expected. He had expected a throne room. This felt more like a meeting between 2 people who had both, at various points in their lives, stopped caring about what rooms were supposed to look like. Orvain looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, the council has ruled. Garrett waited. The bond is confirmed. Uncontested. Permanent. Orvain's voice had that same low, clear quality, like sound moving through deep water. But it has been reclassified. What Sarah has formed with you is not a standard bond. Based on the rate of her development, her behavior, and what we observed 3 nights ago, the council has classified it as a sovereign bond. Garrett said, what does that mean? It means no galactic authority has jurisdiction over Sarah without your consent. She speaks for herself in all things. You speak for her when she cannot. No ruler, no fleet, no council, including this one, can override that. Silence. The 7 rulers who came to your mountain, Orvain continued, no longer have standing to pursue the matter. The operatives who came 3 nights ago have created a significant legal problem for whoever sent them. It is being handled. Garrett nodded slowly. And what does that make me? Orvain was quiet for a moment. There is no current title that fits exactly. The old word is keeper. But it is not accurate. A keeper implies custody. You do not keep her. She chose you. So what do you call it? Orvain looked at him steadily. The one she chose. Garrett sat with that. I didn't plan for any of this, he said. I know. Orvain's hands rested on the table, still and old and calm. That is the point. Every ruler who came to your mountain had a plan. They had a use in mind, a place they would put her, a thing they would make her. She has traveled through the seats of 9 empires, and she rejected every single one. And then she knocked on the door of a man who had no plan, who opened it because it was cold, and then said no, and then changed his mind, and then heated soup in a small kitchen. Garrett looked at the table. She was not looking for power, Orvain said. She was not looking for protection or a throne to rest beneath. I believe she was looking for someone who would let her exist without deciding in advance what she was for. A pause. That is rarer than any throne in this galaxy. Garrett said, I still don't know what I'm doing. Orvain said, neither does she. That is why it will work. He stood. The meeting was over. At the door he stopped, the way he had stopped after the reckoning, and he said without turning fully, she chose well. Then he was gone. Garrett walked back up the mountain alone. The ships in orbit had already begun to move, some leaving, some repositioning. Drevka's fleet would stay a while longer, he knew. The legal matter of the operatives would take time. There would be more meetings, more people arriving with datapads and questions and things that needed to be signed. But that was later. Koss was leaning on the fence post when Garrett reached the cabin. He had brought a second cup, which meant he had planned to stay. He looked out at the valley, at the remaining ships, at Sarah asleep on the porch in the last warm stretch of afternoon sun. She was large enough now that she took up most of it. So Koss said, what are you going to do? Garrett took the second cup. He looked up at the ships. He looked at Sarah. Her scales were the deep, rich dark of clear water at depth, catching the sunlight in slow, shifting pieces. Same thing I've always done, he said. Show up. Do the work. Don't leave anyone behind. Koss thought about it. Good enough, he said. They stood there and drank their coffee while the light went slow and golden across the mountain, and the old dragon slept on the porch with one copper eye cracked open, and the bond between them settled quiet and warm, like a fire that has been burning long enough to know it is not going out.